大家好，讀你聽2.0嘅時間，今日繼續讀 A.Christie 嘅 Sparkling Cyanide， 讀到 Book 3嘅第6節啦。咁上回第5節咧就講Colonel Race 就去揾 Ruth Lessing 咧就落口供，咁成篇咧都係講 Ruth Lessing 啦，包括佢坦誠啦，佢係中意 George Barton 啦，然之後就係佢同 George Barton 之間嘅關係啦，上司下屬嘅關係啦，冇咩感情上面嘅嘢嘅。咁同埋就係Ruth 佢話佢唔知道George Barton 嘅呢個計劃，表現出咧即係有啲傷心，因為佢認為George 就瞞住佢咧。但係後嚟佢亦都明白到原來George 係收到呢啲信，佢亦都將自己列入咗疑兇之一咁樣，佢對George 多啲諒解咁樣。然之後就係探員 Race 對於 Ruth 嘅猜測啦、啲懷疑啦咁樣。好，我哋呢一節睇下呢個案情點樣繼續落去啦。Lucila Drake was delighted to see Colonel Race. The blinds were all down and Lucila came into the room draped in black and with a handkerchief to her eyes and explained, as she advanced a tremulous hand to meet his, how of course she couldn't have seen anyone at all, except such an old friend of dear George's, and it was so dreadful to have no man in the house. Really, without a man in the house who didn't know how to tackle anything. Just herself, a poor lonely widow, and Iris just a helpless young girl, and George had always looked after everything. So kind of dear Colonel Race, and really she was so grateful. No idea what they ought to do. Of course, Miss Lessing would attend to all business matters, and a funeral to arrange for, but how about the inquest? And so dreadful having the police actually in the house, plain clothes of course, and really very considerate. But she was so bewildered, and the whole thing was such an absolute tragedy, and didn't Colonel Race think it must be all due to suggestion? That was what the psychoanalyst said, wasn't it? That everything is suggestion, and poor George at that horrid place, the Luxembourg, and practically the same party, and remembering how poor Rosemary had died there, and it must have come over him quite suddenly. Only if he'd listened to what she, Lucila, had said, and taken that excellent tonic of dear Dr. Gaskell's, run down all the summer, yes, thoroughly run down. Whereupon Lucila herself ran down temporarily, and Race had a chance to speak. He said how deeply he sympathized, and how Mrs. Drake must count upon him in every way. Whereupon Lucila started off again and said it was indeed kind of him, and it was the shock that had been so terrible, here today and gone tomorrow, as it said in the Bible, cometh up like grass and cut down in the evening, only that wasn't quite right. But Colonel Race would know what she meant, and it was so nice to feel there was someone on whom they could rely. Miss Lessing meant well, of course, and was very efficient, but rather an unsympathetic manner, and sometimes took things upon herself a little too much, and in her, Lucila's opinion, George had always relied upon her far too much, and at one time she had been really afraid that he might do something foolish, which would have been a great pity, and probably she would have bullied him unmercifully once they were married. Of course she, Lucila, had seen what was in the wind. Dear Iris was so unworldly, and it was nice. Didn't Colonel Race think for young girls to be unspoilt and simple? Iris had really always been very young for her age and very quiet. One didn't know half the time what she was thinking about. Rosemary, being so pretty and so gay, had been out a great deal, and Iris had mooned about the house, which wasn't really right for a young girl. They should go to classes, cooking and perhaps dressmaking. It occupied their minds, and one never knew when it might come in useful. It had really been a mercy that she, Lucila, had been free to come and live here after poor Rosemary's death. That horrid flu, quite an unusual kind of flu, Dr. Gaskell had said. Such a clever man, and such a nice breezy manner. She had wanted Iris to see him this summer. The girl had looked so white and pulled down. But really, Colonel Race, I think it was the situation of the house. Low, you know, the damp, with quite a miasma in the evenings. Poor George had gone off and bought it all by himself without asking anyone's advice. Such a pity. He had said he wanted it to be a surprise, but really it would have been better if he had taken some older women's advice. Men knew nothing about houses. George may have realized that she, Lucila, would have been willing to take any amount of trouble. For, after all, what was her life now? Her dear husband dead many years ago, and Victor, her dear boy, far away in the Argentine. She meant Brazil, or was it the Argentine? Such an affectionate, handsome boy. Colonel Ray said he had heard she had a son abroad. For the next quarter of an hour, he was regaled with a full account of Victor's multitudinous activities. Such a spirited boy, willing to turn his hand to anything. Here followed a list of Victor's varied occupations, never unkind or bearing malice to anyone. He's always been unlucky, Colonel Race. He was misjudged by his housemaster, and I consider the authorities at Oxford behaved quite disgracefully. People don't seem to understand that a clever boy with a taste for drawing would think it an excellent joke to imitate someone's handwriting. He did it for the fun of the thing, not for money. But he'd always been a good son to his mother, and he never failed to let her know when he was in trouble, which showed, didn't it, that he trusted her. Only it did seem curious, didn't it, that the jobs people found for him so often seemed to take him out of England. She couldn't help feeling that if only he could be given a nice job, in the Bank of England, say, he would settle down much better. He might perhaps live a little out of London and have a little car. It was quite 20 minutes before Colonel Race, having heard all Victor's perfections and misfortunes, was able to switch Lucila from the subject of sons to that of servants. Yes, it was very true what he said. The old-fashioned type of servant didn't exist any longer. Really the trouble people had nowadays. Not that she ought to complain, for really they had been very lucky. Mrs. Pound, though she had the misfortune to be slightly deaf, was an excellent woman. Her pastry sometimes a little heavy and a tendency to over-pepper the soup, but really on the whole most reliable, and economical too. She had been there ever since George married, and she had made no fuss about going to the country this year, though there had been trouble with the others over that, and the parlour maid had left. But that really was all for the best. An impertinent girl who answered back. Besides breaking 6 of the best wine glasses, not one by one at odd times, which might happen to anybody, but all at once, which really meant gross carelessness. Didn't Colonel Race think so? Very careless indeed. That is what I told her, and I said to her that I should be obliged to say so in her reference, for I really feel one has a duty, Colonel Race. I mean, one should not mislead. Faults should be mentioned as well as good qualities, but the girl was really, quite insolent, and said that at any rate she hoped that in her next place she wouldn't be in the kind of house where people got bumped off. A dreadful common expression acquired at the cinema, I believe, and ludicrously inappropriate, since poor dear Rosemary took her own life, though not at the time responsible for her actions, as the coroner very rightly pointed out, and that dreadful expression refers, I believe, to gangsters executing each other with Tommy guns. I am so thankful that we have nothing of that kind in England. And so, as I say, I put in her reference that Betty Archdale thoroughly understood her duties as parlour-maid and was sober and honest, but that she was inclined to have too many breakages and was not always respectful in her manner. And personally, if I had been Mrs. Rees Talbot, I should have read between the lines and not engaged her. But people nowadays just jump at anything they can get, and will sometimes take a girl who has only stayed a month in 3 places running. Whilst Mrs. Drake paused to take breath, Colonel Race asked quickly whether that was Mrs. Richard Rees Talbot. If so, he had known her, he said, in India. I really couldn't say. Cadogan Square was the address. Then it is, my friends. Lucila said that the world was such a small place, wasn't it? And that there were no friends like old friends. Friendship was a wonderful thing. She had always thought it had been so romantic about Viola and Paul. Dear Viola, she had been a lovely girl, and so many men in love with her. But oh dear, Colonel Race wouldn't even know who she was talking about, only did so tend to relive the past. Colonel Race begged her to go on, and in return for this politeness received the life history of Hector Marle, of his upbringing by his sister, of his peculiarities and his weaknesses, and finally, when Colonel Race had almost forgotten her, of his marriage to the beautiful Viola. She was an orphan, you know, and a ward in Chancery. He heard how Paul Bennet, conquering his disappointment at Viola's refusal, had transformed himself from lover to family friend, and of his fondness for his godchild Rosemary, and of his death in the terms of his will, which I have always felt most romantic. Such an enormous fortune. Not of course that money is everything. No, indeed. One has only to think of poor Rosemary's tragic death, and even dear Iris I am not quite happy about. Race gave her an inquiring look. I find responsibility most worrying. The fact that she is a great heiress is of course well known. I keep a very sharp eye on the undesirable type of young men. But what can one do, Colonel Race? One can't look after girls nowadays as one used to. Iris has friends I know next to nothing about. Ask them to the house, dear, is what I always say. But I gather that some of these young men simply will not be brought. Poor George was worried too, about a young man called Brown. I myself have never seen him, but it seems that he and Iris have been seeing a good deal of each other, and one does feel that she could do better. George didn't like him, I'm quite sure of that, and I always think, Colonel Race, that men are so much better judges of other men. I remember thinking Colonel Pusey, one of our church wardens, such a charming man, but my husband always preserved a very distant attitude towards him and enjoined on me to do the same. And sure enough, one Sunday when he was handing round the offertory plate, he fell right down, completely intoxicated it seems, and of course afterwards, one always hears these things afterwards, so much better if one heard them before. We found out that dozens of empty brandy bottles were taken out of the house every week. It was very sad really, because he was truly religious, though inclined to be evangelical in his views. He and my husband had a terrific battle over the details of the service on All Saints' Day. Oh dear, All Saints' Day, to think that yesterday was All Saints' Day. A faint sound made Race look over Lucila's head at the open doorway. He had seen Iris before, at Little Prior's. Nevertheless, he felt that he was seeing her now for the first time. He was struck by the extraordinary tension behind her stillness, and her wide eyes met his with something in their expression that he felt he ought to recognize, yet failed to do so. In her turn, Lucila Drake turned her head. Iris, dear, I didn't hear you come in. You know Colonel Race, he is being so very kind. Iris came and shook hands with him gravely. The black dress she wore made her look thinner and paler than he remembered her. I came to see if I could be of any help to you, said Race. Thank you, that was so kind of you. She had had a bad shock, that was evident, and was still suffering from the effects of it. But had she been so fond of George that his death could affect her so powerfully? She turned her eyes to her aunt, and Race realized that they were watchful eyes. She said, What were you talking about just now as I came in? Lucila became pink and flustered. Race guessed that she was anxious to avoid any mention of the young man Anthony Brown. She exclaimed, Now let me see. Oh yes, All Saints' Day, and yesterday being All Souls. All Souls, that seems to me such an odd thing, one of those coincidences one never believes in the real life. Do you mean, said Iris, that Rosemary came back yesterday to fetch George? Lucila gave a little scream. Iris, dear, don't! What a terrible thought! So unchristian. Why unchristian? It's the Day of the Dead. In Paris, people used to go and put flowers on the graves. Oh, I know, dear, but then they are Catholics, aren't they? A faint smile twisted Iris's lips. Then she said directly, I thought perhaps you were talking of Anthony Brown. Well, Lucila's twitter became very high and bird-like. As a matter of fact, we did just mention him. I happened to say, you know, that we know nothing about him. Iris interrupted, her voice hard. Why should you know anything about him? No, dear, of course not. At least, I mean, well, it would be rather nice, wouldn't it, if we did? You'll have every chance of doing so in the future, said Iris, because I'm going to marry him. Oh, Iris, it was halfway between a wail and a bleat. You mustn't do anything rash. I mean, nothing can be settled at present. It is settled, Aunt Lucila. No, dear, one can't talk about things like marriage when the funeral hasn't even taken place yet. It wouldn't be decent, and there's dreadful inquest and everything. And really, Iris, I don't think dear George would have approved. He didn't like this Mr. Brown. No, said Iris, George wouldn't have liked it, and he didn't like Anthony. But that doesn't make any difference. It's my life, not George's, and anyway, George is dead. Mrs. Drake gave another wail. Iris, Iris, what has come over you? Really, that was the most unfeeling thing to say. I'm sorry, Aunt Lucila. The girl spoke wearily. I know it must have sounded like that, but I didn't mean it that way. I only meant that George is at peace somewhere and hasn't got to worry about me and my future anymore. I must decide things for myself. Nonsense, dear. Nothing can be decided at a time like this. It would be most unfitting. The question simply doesn't arise. Iris gave a sudden short laugh. But it has arisen. Anthony asked me to marry him before we left Little Prior's. He wanted me to come up to London and marry him the next day without telling anyone. I wish now that I had. Surely that was a very curious request, said Colonel Race gently. She turned defiant eyes to him. No, it wasn't. It would have saved a lot of fuss. Why couldn't I trust him? He asked me to trust him, and I didn't. Anyway, I'll marry him now as soon as he likes. Lucila burst out in a stream of incoherent protest. Her plump cheeks quivered and her eyes filled. Colonel Reyes took rapid charge of the situation. Miss Mao, might I have a word with you before I go? On a strictly business matter. Rather startled, the girl murmured yes, and found herself moving to the door. As she passed through, Reyes took a couple of strides back to Mrs. Drake. Don't upset yourself, Mrs. Drake. Lee said, soonest mended. We'll see what we can do. Leaving her slightly comforted, he followed Iris, who led him across the hall and into a small room giving out on the back of the house, where a melancholy plane tree was shedding its last leaves. Ray spoke in a businesslike tone. All I had to say, Miss Mao, was that Chief Inspector Kemp is a personal friend of mine, and that I am sure you will find him most helpful and kindly. His duty is an unpleasant one, but I'm sure he will do it with the utmost consideration possible. She looked at him for a moment or two without speaking. Then she said abruptly, Why didn't you come and join us last night as George expected you to do? He shook his head. George didn't expect me. But he said he did. He may have said so, but it wasn't true. George knew perfectly well that I wasn't coming. She said, But that empty chair, who was it for? Not for me. Her eyes half closed and her face went very white. She whispered, It was for Rosemary. I see, it was for Rosemary. He thought she was going to fall. He came quickly to her and steadied her, then forced her to sit down. Take it easy, she said in a low, breathless voice. I'm all right, but I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Can I help you? She raised her eyes to his face. They were wistful and somber. Then she said, I must get things clear. I must get them. She made a groping gesture with her hands, in sequence. First of all, George believed Rosemary didn't kill herself, but was killed. He believed that because of those letters. Colonel Reyes, who wrote those letters? I don't know. Nobody knows. Have you yourself any idea? I simply can't imagine. Anyway, George believed what they said, and he arranged his party last night, and he had an empty chair, and it was All Souls' Day. That's the Day of the Dead, and it was a day when Rosemary's spirit could have come back and told him the truth. You mustn't be too imaginative. But I felt her myself, felt her quite near sometimes. I'm her sister, and I think she's trying to tell me something. Take it easy, Iris. I must talk about it. George drank Rosemary's health and he died. Perhaps she came and took him. The spirits of the dead don't put potassium cyanide in a champagne glass, my dear. The words seemed to restore her balance. She said in a more normal tone, But it's so incredible. George was killed. Yes, killed. That's what the police think, and it must be true, because there isn't any other alternative. But it doesn't make sense. Don't you think it does? If Rosemary was killed, and George was beginning to suspect by whom, she interrupted him. Yes, but Rosemary wasn't killed. That's why it doesn't make sense. George believed those stupid letters partly because depression after influenza isn't a very convincing reason for killing yourself. But Rosemary had a reason. Look, I'll show you. She ran out of the room and returned a few moments later with a folded letter in her hand. She thrust it on him. Read it, see for yourself. He unfolded the slightly crumpled sheet. Leopard, darling. He read it twice before handing it back. The girl said eagerly, You see, she was unhappy, broken-hearted. She didn't want to go on living. Do you know to whom that letter was written? Iris nodded. Stephen Faraday. It wasn't Anthony. She was in love with Stephen, and he was cruel to her. So she took the stuff with her to the restaurant and drank it there where he could see her die. Perhaps she hoped he'd be sorry then. Reyes nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. After a moment or two, he said, When did you find this? About 6 months ago. It was in the pocket of an old dressing gown. You didn't show it to George? Iris cried passionately. How could I? How could I? Rosemary was my sister. How could I give her away to George? He was so sure that she loved him. How could I show him this after she was dead? He'd got it all wrong, but I couldn't tell him so. But what I want to know is, what am I to do now? I've shown it to you because you were George's friend. Has Inspector Kemp got to see it? Yes, Kemp must have it. It's evidence, you see. But then they might read it out in court? Not necessarily. That doesn't follow. It's George's death that is being investigated. Nothing will be made public that is not strictly relevant. You had better let me take this now. Very well. She went with him to the front door. As he opened it, she said abruptly, It does show, doesn't it, that Rosemary's death was suicide? Ray said, It certainly shows that she had a motive for taking her own life. She gave a deep sigh. He went down the steps. Glancing back once, he saw her standing framed in the open doorway, watching him walk away across the square. 好啦，呢一節咧就係講Iris 嘅觀點啦 ，Iris 嘅角度啦。Iris 認為George 係唔知道 Rosemary 同 Stephen 之間嘅事啦，亦都有交代 Iris 決定同 Anthony Brown 去結婚啦，亦都唔理呢個 Lucila 嘅反對啦咁樣。好啦，睇下呢節有3個字同大家分享啦。第一個字 Miasma， 佢係形容佢屋企嗰個唔好嘅氣氛unpleasant or unhealthy smell of vapor。An oppressive or unpleasant atmosphere which surrounds or emanates from something。我哋中文就烏煙瘴氣啦，又或者係一啲唔好嘅氛圍啦，唔好嘅氣氛啦。另外一個字 multitudinous， 即係 very numerous 嘅意思consisting of or containing many individuals or elements， 好多樣嘅multitudinous。應該係形容 Victor Drake 啦，形容佢做過好多嘢佢嘅。或者係佢性格多樣咁啦。仲有一個字 impertinent 唔禮貌啦，不敬啦呢個係Lucila 形容佢嗰啲新嚟嘅女工啦，新嚟嘅女僕啦，就話佢哋不禮貌啦not showing proper respect rude 冇禮貌嘅。好，呢節係咁多先，下次再繼續，拜拜。